And eventually, it does become one political structure. And this nation, this country, refers to themselves as Kemet. They also use a couple other names like Waseti, and it's debated exactly how Kemet was pronounced. But that is what they call themselves, or at least one of the things, and that's the name I'll primarily be using to describe them today. Now, this is commonly referred to as the unification of Kemet. But from what I've read, the unification of Kemet, it wasn't like one event. It's not like someone just went wham bam in 2 years the whole thing was united. It's just, as I said, gradual unity. People gradually, making alliances, conquering other people. But the person who's commonly given credit for uniting Kemet is known as Narmer. Um, there are some other names. I'll say that there's some other names who are given credit for this unification as well. Like Menes is another one. But most historians seem to agree that Narmer and Menes are probably the same person, just because people would have different names for different purposes, especially people who were a pharaoh, because Narmer was a pharaoh. I'll get into what that was later. Um, but yeah, but that's the person who's commonly given credit for the unification, I guess, because he gave it that final push to really consolidate it. But it really was a gradual process. So anyway, after that point, Kemet exists, and mind you, the Nile Valley civilization began tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of years ago. But Kemet, there is some debate among historians the exact date when Kemet became one nation. The earliest date I've seen was, according to the European time numbering system, 4500 CE, which would be about 6,500 years before now. But then, according to some other sources, they'll say 3100 CE, which would make that 5,100 years from now. And FYI, the black scholars tend to place the date earlier than the Caucasian scholars. But I haven't looked in depth to see exactly who's right. But we know obviously some of the political agendas behind putting the dates at different times. But anyway, then Kemet was founded. So now, Kemet exists. So what was Kemet like? Now, first, there are said to be have been, I believe, 26 dynasties of Kemet before their first. No, it was 15 dynasties of Kemet before their first conquest, mind you. And the dynastic period, which began with Narmer, right? Because the first person who unified Kemet said to be the first pharaoh, and each pharaoh has a dynasty, right? So that lasted for thousands of years. But they're said to be, there were dozens of dynasties, but before Kemet's first conquest, and mind you, now we're into the second part of the lecture. This is what Kemet was like. I told you about the rise. Now we're into what it was like. But now, when we're talking about what it was like, right? There are 15 about dynasties before its first conquest, and the conquest I'll talk about in the third part, the fall, right? But anyway, there are about 15 of those, and each one is measured by the, I guess, family that was ruling, right? And these are the families who held the position of pharaoh. So now, what was pharaoh? So pharaoh is commonly translated as king, but it was not a king. King, we have to remember, is a Eurasian, largely Eurasian. Maybe you can't say technically that no African ever had a king before a certain point, but I'm not really aware of any that had a leadership position that could be accurately described as a king, although positions often get mistranslated as king. But the pharaoh is not a king, because a king is someone who owns the land you're on. So, like, for example, the historical kings of England literally owned England. England was like their backyard. But then they had the grace to allow the other human beings who they had, beat over the head to get the right to that land, to live on the land. That's why to this day, the queen, who's obviously the descendant of those kings, is known as Her Grace because she's just so nice for letting people exist. But anyway, that is not what was going on in Kemet. The pharaoh really was more of a spiritual position, and this will be getting into science and metaphysics, which again I'll be covering in a second. But the pharaoh was a spiritual leader who handled spiritual duties, and I know this based upon my study and listening to other people who studied African systems of government and spirituality. And we know that obviously there are variances, but they're generally quite similar. And I've heard people say that the pharaoh wasn't king. Like I know in one of his lectures, the late great Dr. Yosef Ben Yakinen said that. But yeah, the pharaoh's not a king. He was a spiritual leader who had spiritual duties that he performed for the good of the whole nation. So this would include stuff like, praying for peace, praying for abundance, that kind of stuff, and all these other things. And so yeah, that's what he was. He's commonly cited as the leader of Egypt, but based upon what I can infer from how African societies were generally structured, um, this was not autocratic rule. It's not like the I don't know the pharaoh walks down the street and just bosses everyone around, tells them what to do. There would have been checks and balances on his power. One of those checks and balances, I'm sure, would have been like a gendered checks and balance, because we know the vast majority of African societies had a balanced system of government. It wasn't a patriarchy, contrary to common belief. Really, the further back in history you go, it actually tends more matriarchal. But you will have male positions of power, but it's certainly not autocratic um, male rule. But anyway, there were probably equivalent female institutions that would have handled certain aspects of society. I need to do research to know exactly what those were, but based off of what I know about the vast majority of African societies, this had to exist. There had to have been some check on that. But anyway, that was the pharaoh. Now, one common myth about the pharaoh and pharaoh families, I'll call them, not like the royal family, because again, they're not kings. But the one common myth about the family of the pharaohs is that they would commit incest. So it's often said that they would marry their siblings to keep the position of pharaoh within the family and all the privileges that came along with that. However, that is not